Andrew here with another episode of 10-Minute Therapy. In our last few videos, we've been examining marriage through the lens of several different important items, what the Bible has to say about marriage, how marriage isn't about us, but actually considering the other person as greater than myself. And in our last video, we looked at something that was very practical, something that we all need to be experts at, and that's listening more than speaking. Today, I want to take a different direction and I want to talk about the concept of forgiveness. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, my marriage isn't really in shambles, there's been no deceit or, God forbid, infidelity. Maybe I don't really need to learn about forgiveness here. I would strongly disagree with you. I think forgiveness is something that needs to be a part of every marriage. And so I want to walk through a couple of things in this video today about what forgiveness is and what it is not. So let's go ahead and start the clock and we will get right to it. In our last video, we examined why listening is such an important attribute of any human relationship, but especially that of marriage. That listening is not something that's always natural for our hearts, because we would much rather speak and defend and explain and argue than we would listen. It's something natural within us that wants to fight for what we believe in or what our opinions are. And so listening becomes this crucial skill. And it's from that concept that I wanted to flow today into the idea of forgiveness. Now, I would argue with you that forgiveness is an incredibly important component of any healthy relationship. It is especially important in marriage. Now, if your marriage has walked through any major difficulties, uh, financial stresses that have led to big communication issues or deceit or even infidelity, you know that forgiveness is a touchy subject. But even if you haven't walked through such things, if you look at your marriage and say, I think our marriage is in a pretty good shape right now, I would argue forgiveness is still incredibly important. Why? Because the truth is, none of us are perfect. And I would argue every week, at least, there's probably a need for you to forgive your spouse of something and for your spouse to forgive you of something. It might be as minor as a harsh word or an attitude or a tone that your spouse spoke to you in, could be an action that was taken against you, or maybe even an inaction. All of these things we need to be great, excellent even at practicing forgiveness. And so I think we need to start with what forgiveness is and then shift into what forgiveness is not. Now, I want to talk in this first part about forgiveness and unforgiveness. You see, I think it's really crucial to recognize that if we're not engaging in forgiveness, then ultimately the opposite of that is unforgiveness. And here's the reality of unforgiveness unforgiveness is like poison to your soul. It leaves you, the person not willing to forgive the other, trapped in a jail cell that you have locked yourself in. It's as if we think that in unforgiveness, when we say I'm not going to forgive this person, as if my unforgiveness is going to hurt them. But the reality is unforgiveness hurts you. Unforgiveness doesn't hurt the other person nearly as much as it hurts you. Unforgiveness, choosing not to forgive, ultimately leaves you trapped in this jail cell that you've locked yourself in of anger, torment, and anguish, and guilt, and shame, and so many other deep, heavy, negative emotions. But the reality of unforgiveness is we can choose to move towards forgiveness in any and all situations. And when we do, it's like you're opening that jail cell door and you're choosing to walk out. I think that's deeply, deeply important. Now, if that's unforgiveness, then forgiveness, I want to give you a new spin on maybe how you view in your mind's eye what forgiveness is. Because as Christians, we have this understanding that we all wrestle with this thing called sin. And our sin is ultimately against a holy God, but we often sin against one another. And in a marriage, especially, when we've hurt one another, we tend to look and say, my spouse hurt me. They lied to me. They cheated on me. They were deceitful. They used harsh words. They brought me down instead of building me up. whatever the sin might be, we view the other person's sin as being against us, and perhaps rightfully so. Someone uses a harsh word against you, lies to you, cheats, steals from you. They've sinned against you. But here's what we miss sometimes when we get into that tunnel vision that the person's sin is against me. We lose sight of the fact that their sin is against a holy God, an almighty God, a perfect and righteous God, first and foremost. Yes, someone's sin against me is a sin against me, but it is more importantly a sin against a holy God, and that is an offense to our almighty God. And I want this to help reshape and shift your perspective of forgiveness. See, if I start to take on this mindset and recognize that someone's sin against me is more importantly a sin against a holy God, then for me to stay in unforgiveness, it's as if I'm planting myself firmly between that person and the Lord. And I do not belong in that position. That is not a spot for me. When we engage in forgiveness, it's as if I'm removing myself from the equation and saying, I forgive you. I'm not holding this offense against you any longer. I won't think on it. I'm letting it go. And I'm entrusting that person to God. And I'm allowing them to bring their sin and confession to a holy God to be reconciled back to Him. So, if we're going to examine forgiveness and why it's so crucial in marriage, then I think one of the most important things we can do for the remainder of this video is examine what forgiveness is not. And the reason for that is I believe that so many of us have a confused perspective of forgiveness. And so we believe these sort of myths and lies about forgiveness. And that's what stands in the way of us engaging in forgiveness of one another. So, over the next few minutes, we're going to just look at what forgiveness is not. And let's start with this: forgiveness is not emotion. Now, as I say that, you might think, well, of course, forgiveness is an emotion. We don't put that under the same category. But the reality is, many of us use this phrase: I don't feel ready to forgive. I'm not ready to forgive him yet. I'm not ready to forgive her yet. I don't feel ready for forgiveness yet. And we buy into this lie that somehow forgiveness is tied to my emotion. And here's why that lie is so damning. Because if you believe forgiveness is tied to how you feel, what happens if you never feel ready to forgive? If you hitch the wagon of forgiveness to the horse of emotion, so to speak, our emotions can be all over the place. Our emotions can take ebbs and flows that we never anticipate, and I might never feel ready for forgiveness. So hear me, forgiveness is not emotion, it is a choice that we make. The next thing that I would say, forgiveness is not trust. This is a big one. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Now, in the course of marriage, the hope is that when we forgive one another, we are willing to engage in rebuilding trust. But it's important to note they're not the same thing. I think, again, people buy into this lie and they think, I don't trust this person, therefore I can't forgive them. That's incorrect. You can forgive someone and recognize that trust is a separate entity that now needs to be repaired and rebuilt. As humans, we all know the pain and the hurt that comes when trust is shattered. And so when we find that in marriage, especially, and we think, I can't forgive this person because our trust is broken. No, you can forgive them. That's the start of the process into rebuilding trust. But as a side note, let me say this: you can forgive someone, and wisdom might say that you shouldn't trust them again. Now, in marriage, again, we want to rebuild trust, but in other human relationships, it's really important that we forgive, but trust may not be something that you need to give back to that person. In other words, not all forgiveness is going to lead to trust because they are separate entities and need to be treated as such. Sometimes in life, when you forgive, it may not be wise to trust that individual again. I think we need to treat trust like a precious commodity and treat it as precious. But let me pull us back in with that little sidetrack back into the context of marriage. In marriage, it's important that we forgive and understand what forgiveness is so that we can offer it and in turn be willing to rebuild trust. But take note, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. The next thing I'm going to throw at you is that forgiveness is not reconciliation. These two go hand in hand, but it's important to note that if we view forgiveness as reconciliation, again, that's where we fall into the trap of thinking that forgiveness is trust and forgiveness is tied to emotion. And we need to separate these things and parse them out into their important pieces. My hope for all marriages is that when we forgive, we're willing to engage in the process of reconciliation. But by itself, forgiveness is not reconciliation, it's a component of reconciliation. In other words, in order to reconcile with someone, especially my spouse, forgiveness needs to happen at the forefront. But there are other components. Confession would be an important component here. For reconciliation to occur, we need both parties to be fully invested in this process. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes one party is willing and one is not. And therefore, we can't achieve reconciliation. There needs to be a rebuilding of trust in the reconciliation process. There needs to be vulnerability. There needs to be connection. And I would argue intimacy, spiritual, physical, emotional, for reconciliation to take place. But all those are pieces that play into reconciliation. Therefore, forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, though we would often connect them together. So when you feel in your heart, I'm going to struggle to reconcile, it doesn't mean that you can't first forgive. And last but not least, this may be the most important piece of this message today. I need you to hear this. Forgiveness is not free. If that hits you sideways, bear with me for a moment while I explain. Ultimately, the greatest example of forgiveness we could ever examine is going to be found in the gospel. The forgiveness that an almighty God gives to an imperfect race of human beings through the sacrifice of his son, Jesus Christ, that forgiveness, that salvation came at an enormous price. God's forgiveness of us was not free. And therefore, when we forgive one another, it's important to recognize it's also not free. It comes at a price, but that price is sacrifice. When I forgive my spouse or when my spouse forgives me, the emotion that I feel from the hurt or the lies or the deceit or the infidelity or whatever we're working through, I'm still left with that hurt and pain. But in forgiveness, I'm choosing not to hold the offense against the other person. I'm entrusting them to the Lord, but my pain doesn't magically go away in that moment. The emotion that I feel, that's still going to be present. That's why it's important to recognize forgiveness isn't emotion. Because when I choose to forgive, there's still a cost here. I now have to heal and rebuild trust and work through the hurt that I have from whatever happened. And so, therefore, there's a cost associated with forgiveness. When I ask someone for forgiveness, it's important that I note the cost that's going to come to them. And when I offer forgiveness, I have to take note that I may not feel ready. I may not be ready to rebuild trust yet. I may be having some questions about reconciliation. I can still choose to forgive and recognize there's a cost associated with it, just as there was a cost associated with the forgiveness that was offered to me. I'm going to leave you with some of the wisest words that were ever offered to me. When we struggle to forgive one another, we're going to call it a horizontal relationship, me to my spouse, or me to a parent, or a child, or a friend. We're going to call that horizontal human relationships. When I struggle to offer horizontal forgiveness, really what's happening is my heart is struggling with vertical forgiveness. That is the forgiveness that God offers me. So think of it like this: you have to go vertical before you can go horizontal. For me to forgive you, I have to first sit and confess my sin to God and recognize the amount of forgiveness and grace He has offered me. And that enables and postures my heart to better be able to forgive the other. I hope you'll take some time to think on these words today, to think about forgiveness, why it's vital and healthy for all human relationships, but especially in marriage. We need to be excellent at loving and forgiving one another. I hope you'll join us in our next video. We're going to continue down this road of examining concepts associated with marriage. But in the meantime, I'm Andrew with 10 Minute Therapy. God bless.